Thank you, Aleem, for setting the stage very well. Aleem, through his training in public policy, really has brought some of those core principles that he laid out and has really influenced the way we approach things. And in opening, I want to say that this is really such a tremendous honor to be engaging with all of you as counselors and to have had the opportunity to see the way you think and the way you pose questions. And the process of the interviews that Aleem described was a very rich experience for us because it brought us out of just thinking about evidence and thinking about how public policy is formed. And it is an integration of evidence, public views, timing, economic and social and economic circumstances. So the context that you've created, and Councillor Carra, the way you described this as a production of information for the public record, I find that to be a very, very gratifying process to be a part of. So again, we are tremendously honored to be here, and I express thanks on behalf of the O'Brien Institute and the University of Calgary because we want to be contributing to public discourse in this city. I want to just say very quickly a couple of the things that Aleem mentioned in his presentation, just to really underline a couple of process and core philosophies, process items and core philosophies that are key. Core activities of the Institute do include, as mentioned, supporting research activities, convening dialogue and discourse, and also supporting a knowledge to action paradigm where knowledge that is generated is appropriately used in a timely way, and again, where appropriate. That latter knowledge to action consideration does include consideration of advocacy activities and advocacy roles. And I'm going to come back to that important point because we know we're in a somewhat charged atmosphere with a diversity of views in the room, and we're going to address that issue. Importantly, and this is articulated in the report, we are careful in the Institute to distinguish the views and advocacy of individuals from the collective voice of the Institute. And I am happy that distinction was made up front, not anticipating that there was necessarily going to be any dissent, but it underlines the fact that a report like this, when we have a membership that involves over 500 members, it's very, very difficult for the executive leadership of the Institute to say that we're standing here with a unanimous voice of 500 people in such a contentious area as community water fluoridation. So the work of the Institute executive is distinguished from the views of individuals where in an academic setting, academic freedom of expression are core values in an academic context. Philosophically, our report on community water fluoridation has involved an explicit inner experience or process of stepping back from what we believe and prior assumptions. We do have teachings in medical schools and public health training on community water fluoridation. So to undertake this review where you challenged us as a city council to be objective, to look hard and look broadly and hear many perspectives, we had to step back. And that was a fairly, I will say, a profound journey for us. And if time permits, we can elaborate on that. We had to listen carefully to many perspectives, those of you on council, of many experts on all sides of the fluoridation debate, from scientists who do the heavy lifting of studies that generate knowledge, and from the proponents and opponents who have assumed explicit advocacy positions. We've had to reconcile through that listening evidence, critiques of evidence, the social media storm that follows, political processes, and the democratic consideration of opinions. And in doing that, we've had to try to be, and we've had to be, broadly respectful. And we sincerely hope that all of you on council and all of you in the room, it's awkward to know there's a room behind me, but all of you in the room, we sincerely hope that you have felt respect from us. Many of you know that today's meeting is a postponed meeting from July. This session was originally scheduled for July 24th. We completed our report and submitted it officially for the agenda and therefore the public record on July 18th. So our document has been in the public space since July 18th, a piñata of sorts. And in some ways, it's been difficult because we committed, not that there was an explicit request from council, but we felt it most appropriate for our first public comments on this to be brought to you here at council. We did not participate in social media. We did not respond to criticisms of the report. We did not respond to the social media storm that followed the August 19th publication of a Canadian study on cognition. We stayed silent, though that wasn't necessarily easy because we have a lot of things to say. But in many ways, the delay has been good because we have had the opportunity to observe a fascinating public discourse, to track reactions and the social media discourse regarding our report. And then we also have had the opportunity to see the flurry of reactions to the recent Canadian cognition study that was conducted by a group at York University. And the subsequent reactions and the camps and perspectives that have commented on that work, on our report. So much is out there. I was overwhelmed by the 970-page agenda package for today. Everybody, I hope, did their homework and read every page. Quite frankly, it is all very dizzying and confusing, no question, because it's really hard to wade through. And how do we make sense of all of this? In the report itself, we open with a description of the extensive advocacy work that is happening on both sides of the fluoride debate. And it's already been stated by Robin and I think also Aleem. The notice of motion arising from the February 2019 council vote was very explicit in saying that the O'Brien Institute was not to present any position or formal recommendation on water fluoridation. In a way, that was very liberating because the first point of stepping back from what we may have learned or assumptions or preconceived notions, not having to state the final answer, therefore fluoride yes, fluoride no, it was liberating to explicitly be told we are not to deliver any final recommendation or final position. But it was also compromising, and I'll get into why. The biggest thing is to say that in our non-positional presentation of evidence, where we just went through a process of describing what appears to be known as best as we could, our report has been criticized very, very strongly. And an impression is advocacy groups are really left wanting and frustrated by a report that lays things out, says it's complicated, and doesn't give a simple answer, doesn't give an easy answer. And that's human nature doesn't like that. It's like watching a hockey game that ends in a tie. Fortunately, we have overtime and shootouts now. That quip about a hockey game, I don't want that to be misinterpreted. I'm not here saying that this issue is like a hockey game with a tie, but people are left wanting. Criticisms that have come to our report have come from Dr. Hardy Limeback, who wrote an official critique on our report that appears on the Peel Region Anti-Fluoridation Group's website. The Fluoride Action Network has provided a critique also that is available on its website. The American Fluoridation Society back in August posted a critique of our report, as well as a recent submission that I just received yesterday from Dr. Johnny Johnson. I thank him for the email. It was shared today or yesterday with Council, so a lengthy critique of our report. Some academic colleagues have critiqued our report, including some colleagues at the University of Calgary who've written to you on Council, wearing, I would say, advocacy hats in the way they wrote their letter, but I respect the advocacy perspective, and we'll say more on that. And then, of course, there's been so much on social media. I will say that for reasons of sanity, after a daily check, my better half suggested I stop looking every night before bedtime at all the tweets. Yeah, never read the comment section. That's absolutely correct. Weighing against the criticism that has come our way from many sides, we have received some very encouraging support from many in medical officer of health roles across Canada. This includes both retired medical officers of health, David Swan, Richard Musto, and then current leaders, David Strong and Rafael Figueiredo. We really appreciate I have tremendous respect for your roles and the difficult decisions that you must make for populations, and I really admire how you work. Dr. Jason Sabai, who is a contributor to the report, also with AHS, has been a very significant advisor and counsel on the difficulties of considering evidence in a public under a public microscope. You've all acknowledged the complexity of the domain and the tightrope act of considering both new and old studies and challenging points of evidence and controversy. So how do we reconcile everything? And then I'm going to get into the facts. I will just say one thing that we in the Institute have had an ongoing discourse over our 10 years, almost 10 years now in existence as a formal institute at the University of Calgary. And a few years ago, we staged a very informative symposium that was entitled Science and Advocacy, Science versus Advocacy, Walking the Fine Line. And there's a tremendous amount written on this fine line. And the two paradigms of science and generating evidence and advocacy sometimes work together very well. And that's in particular that knowledge to action paradigm where there's new evidence, it's really beneficial. If something is beneficial, a treatment in medicine or an intervention in public health, and there's a collective will to get it done and to shift policy in that positive direction, and that's all good. Occasionally, science and advocacy can clash. And for some issues, those who advocate very aggressively in areas of uncertainty in many ways become too passionate to be credible voices. And I'm just being careful. I'm not saying that the many people who are going to stand up are not credible because there's so much knowledge in this room. But people internally need to constantly reflect on the science and advocacy, science versus advocacy question, and really think internally about whether there can be an openness to challenging facts and evidence. And then also, is there an ability to engage in fact-focused discourse where we sometimes have to change our minds? Again, I'm just going to say this. There's no denouncing of advocates as I stand here. The world would not be as good a place as it is if there was not advocacy. But we do note how it shapes narratives. I mentioned just a few minutes ago the different criticisms of the report or the critiques of the report. There's a difference between critique and criticism, but nevertheless. I want to mention the American Fluoridation Society's critique of our report. And I just want to characterize how the different critiques from the different positions actually appear as mirror images of one another. The AFS critique, particularly the one in the summer, applauds and very quickly endorses and just briefly says our description of the benefits of fluoride for preventing cavities, well done. Fluoride cessation studies, well done. So just very quick endorsement of those areas of the report, and then strongly criticizes our description of the potential effects of fluoride on cognition as well as our section on dental fluorosis, which is an undesired effect of water fluoridation. The limitations of those observational studies on cognition are scrutinized heavily in the AFS critique and emphasized, with absolutely no mention of very similar limitations in the studies on benefits of fluoridation. And in our midst, I don't want to scoop her, but Dr. Lindsay McLaren says we have to be really observant of this cognition work. The limitations that work has are very analogous to the limitations that her own work was dissected for and criticized publicly for. So just that similar approach to critiquing. In the Fluoride Action Network and Hardy-Limeback critiques, we have basically the mirror image or precisely opposing criticisms. Those critiques applaud the O'Brien Institute's mention and description of the recent cognition research, which is described as fabulous, flawless research. But then we have stinging criticism for our handling of the literature on benefits of fluoride and how we describe the fluoride cessation studies at the municipal level. So, and then of course, those are the formally packaged report critiques, and what we think the bottom line is that dots are being connected in a way that anchors to the polarized positions. Instead of, again, I mentioned it was liberating for us, instead of being able to just say, well, there are dots to connect, and it's not a simple, perfectly beneficial, perfectly harmful. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the whole landscape. It's complicated. And the connecting of dots, human nature, we like to distill and simplify. Again, I say that not to criticize people in this room, but it's clearly what has happened. And the social media discourse has been more shallow than those thoughtful critiques that have been written by the different groups, but extremely polarized. And we have a section in the report that talks about that, how social media tends to be a place where there's particularly polarized views that are presented, and presented in a little bit of a superficial soundbite format. We know that there will be no way to get through today with a uniformly satisfied audience. In fact, I suspect that the opposite will be true, knowing many of you are here for the very reason of wanting to react to the report and present positions on both sides of this. I have already scoped out secret emergency exits in the chamber, and we'll try to sneak out. I will not. I'm here. Kidding aside, I really do want to emphasize sincere respect for the advocacy surrounding fluoride, because I respect public engagement. A public that does not care would be a very bad thing. So the public cares, and I think we want that. I know Aleem in public policy, we want that. I respect the collective knowledge of so many of you that I've spoken with and that we've received submissions from and written critiques from. And I do respect those critiques, but with a plea for some honest introspection surrounding how and why people can feel so sure in areas that are definitely not areas of uncertainty. One other upfront criticism to address is that one critique called out our report for merely going in the middle of the pro versus con fluoride arguments, basically saying, oh, we were just being in the middle just to be there, because I was challenged in council in February at the meeting, oh, can we trust the O'Brien Institute? So people are saying, oh, you just wanted to be in the middle, and I can disclose I'm a Swiss citizen through my mother, so maybe that's exactly what I was doing. But I'm just going to say this very firmly, we really strongly reject that criticism. We're not in the middle just to be there, and our report doesn't put us in the middle. We just lay out information that we have encountered and reviewed very carefully. And we are doing what we were told to do. objectively review and describe evidence on all sides of this important public health question. We're trying to help council reconcile all of this and make sense of all that's out there. And in the suggestion that our report is somehow problematic to positions, I challenge the critics on both sides to consider how ridiculous our report would have looked and how it would have been viewed by the city and anyone looking at this in a non-positional way had we feigned certainty where there isn't certainty, and had we ignored or blindly denounced in just a simple black and white way new cognition studies that include studies here in Canada, when those are now rightly the focus of much attention from both sides of this controversy. It would have been absurd for that information to not be there. And for those of us who had to really stare at that evidence, talk to the researchers doing the studies, and process it all, critique it, we lost sleep, like literally lost sleep, because when you have a belief and you have evidence that might be changing, that's not easy to process. I'm going to go to my slides now. So that was a long preamble. The ending of this is short because I'm just going to go through the infographics that were part of the report, and they're in the report for those of you who have them because of size on the screen. And I'm just really presenting a high-level review of the findings, and I've already said that these are the piñata now, so you can get your sticks out if you want. The first slide was a focus on the benefits in children. I didn't say much in the preamble about the CADITH report. The CADITH report is a very lengthy review by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health. And it is an agency that does what is often referred to as health technology assessment or evidence reviews around interventions to provide information to decision makers on the benefits, costs, potential risks associated with candidate interventions. And that report was very useful for our work, though it has limitations that are described in the social media and online criticisms, and those criticisms should be reviewed by people who want to understand that all reports, ours included, are subject to criticism. However, on benefits of fluoridation in children, there is a robust body of evidence that is summarized in pretty extensive systematic reviews that include many studies. And the long and short of it is that there is about a I'll just say over 40% reduction in cavities in baby teeth. So the teeth, I just call them baby teeth. Raphael can forgive me for poor terminology, but that's how we know them. And there's about a 37% relative reduction in children's permanent teeth affected by cavities. Sometimes those numbers are questioned in terms of how significant that really is, what's the morbidity, and I think you're going to hear later today that there is significant morbidity associated with that from many of the people who present. We have a whole section in the report that talks about the substantial and surprising disease burden associated with poor oral health. Importantly, in the review, there is a study showing a 50% lower rate of hospital admissions for surgical treatment of tooth decay. That's a pretty devastating consequence of tooth decay when you have to subject a child to a general anesthetic and a hospital admission. So a 50% reduction of that is certainly an important and desirable outcome. Next slide, Robin. In adults, the evidence on the benefits of fluoridation are also there. So while a lot of the research focused on benefits in children, there is actually about a 1/3 reduction in the number of teeth affected by decay in cavities. Interestingly, though, when you look at it just in terms of, well, what's the effect on a single person averaged out over a population, it's somewhere between 1 cavity or 2 cavities fewer for over a 40-year period for people who live in an area where there's community water fluoridation. So at the individual level, depending on what side you're on, some people will say, well, that's negligible, one cavity, easy to deal with. But of course, projected over a population, that's a pretty substantial burden that is reduced, and that's distinct from the benefits in children. So those are the estimates. And then really importantly, the benefit of community water fluoridation for tooth decay and cavities is not confined to the to children. There's also some interest in the vulnerable elderly, where ability to attend to oral health and hygiene may be compromised by physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and in that population as well, there may be some benefits. So those are benefits that are described. Next slide. Oh, well, actually, I'll make the next comment. I'll speak to this slide. Community water fluoridation cessation studies have been under the microscope. And here in Council, there was a lot of discussion about Lindsay McLaren's research funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR, looking at what happened in terms of rates of cavities in the Calgary population after fluoride was removed from the water supply and after the 2011 decision. There are there are many other else before I go on, because one of the criticisms of our report was the assertion that we were not describing other cessation studies, such as one around 2000 in Comox, British Columbia, study in North Carolina. We actually do, in the section of the report, cite a systematic review of 15 studies, so 15 other studies beyond the 3 that are on this slide, that show several jurisdictions where there was an increase in tooth decay when fluoride was removed from the water supply. And then there is Lindsay McLaren's Calgary Edmonton study. There's a study in Juneau, Alaska. There's a study in Windsor, Ontario that's not published in the peer review literature, though that may have changed recently. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of it being in the peer reviewed literature. But collectively, both the review of the old 15 studies and then these newer ones do suggest a not surprising, and I say not surprising, increase in cavities associated with cessation. And that's simply because all those other data that I showed on the 2 preceding slides, if benefit is shown in some studies, it's not surprising that cessation is associated with an uptick. I will make some comments, though, to say this is messy research. It's observational epidemiology, where there are many clever, valid criticisms of potential confounders, potential factors in the studies that raise some questions, not unlike some of the observational studies on cognition. However, combining these cessation studies with the systematic reviews on benefits, it certainly leaves us with the impression that community water fluoridation is beneficial. The other important thing is to comment on inequities. With Joy here from the Alex, there are several studies that suggest that inequity in oral health is mitigated and reduced in areas where there is community water fluoridation, and that is again understandable, because water fluoridation is an intervention that has tremendous reach because the intervention is in the water. It also has potential harms, so it's not, again, I don't want to seem like I'm biased as I present, but just framing why inequity could be reduced. Next slide. This last visual is I will say, terrible oversimplification of literature on harms. But again, we were trying to distill in the report. That was the objective, and at least present some bottom line. So there is consistent evidence that fluoride causes fluorosis. And it's interesting talking to people on both sides of the debate. Some say fluorosis is a terrible thing that causes psychological distress and is incredibly upsetting and not easy to treat. And then others say it's nothing, it's tiny, a few spots on the teeth, no big deal. There are varying degrees of fluorosis, and there's some disagreement in the classification of severity of fluorosis. Sometimes between observers, two people would say different things. Suffice it to say, however, there is an increase in the rate of fluorosis, and that is described in the report. And the prevalence is potentially around 12% of degrees of fluorosis that are not negligible. And there will be quibbles in the critiques. You can go online and you'll see the way different sides have critiqued. There is active research that's currently ongoing and that's still needed in the area of cognition. And that's what I'm going to speak to in a little bit more detail. The cognition research focuses mostly on the developing brain. Evidence on effects of fluoride on adult brains as a potential cause of dementia as we age is very mixed and not viewed as being highly suggestive of an effect on the fully developed brain. But the research that's actively ongoing, and it's not just the August 19th Canadian study published by a group at York, it's also recent research published from Mexico and some prior research before that. And it's very controversial. Anti-fluoride groups are saying, see, this is a poison that is affecting brains. This is the biggest shameful moment in the history of public health. So that's the narrative you have. Pro-fluoride advocacy perspectives are attacking the research and saying it's discredited, it's terrible research. So that's what's being said, and you're going to. I mean, again, I say this respectfully. I think we're going to hear that in this chamber today. In between those two viewpoints, I'm going to say there are credible peer-reviewed journals that are publishing this work. The most recent Canadian study was published in JAMA Pediatrics. Anyone knows that publishing in the JAMA network journals, the Journal of the American Medical Association, incredibly difficult. Work is scrutinized. And this particular work was actually double reviewed, and there was a supplementary statistical review for the August 19th Canadian study. There are accompanying editorials that have far from discredited the work, that have said that this requires attention and needs to be considered in context of other evidence that's emerging. The studies can't be undone, and they can't be unpublished. Huge amount of public resources, both of the big cognition studies were funded by the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is incredibly competitive funding, tremendous amount of rigor in the review of the proposals to do the work, and then many years to do the work. And if there's one thing that I get angry about as a person who supports research, is the notion that you can just talk away the 10 years of work by committed investigators. That's the only thing I get angry about, because I respect the doers of the research and the deliverers of the evidence, and I don't think they should be shot for tough messages. There was a CADITH rapid review. So CADITH did the big review, and at Dr. Figueiredo's request, a CADITH rapid review was done of recent cognition studies related to fluoridated water supplies. CADITH reviewed the literature, and through that process identified one notable new study, and that is the York University study of several Canadian cities that found an association between high intake of fluoride, or higher intake of fluoride in pregnancy, and lower cognition in children some years later. A finding that for the best measure of fluoride intake, which is urinary fluoride, was only seen in boys, not girls. Other measures of fluoride intake were seen in both boys and girls in terms of cognitive effects. The CADITH review did the process of reviewing the study design, were confounders attended to, was the analysis correct, number of things, were there selection biases, was the sample size sufficient, and they identify a number of limitations that, again, I think you're going to hear about, and then they make a bottom line conclusion. The evidence, this is verbatim, the evidence is weak due to multiple limitations. But then they also say this cannot be ignored, and further well-conducted research is now needed to address uncertainty. So that's the Cadith comment on the cognition study from August 19th. On Tuesday last week, a US report in draft form was released by the National Toxicology Program. And this is a formal systematic review, very extensive, and it is informing a November 6th public hearing in Washington, D.C. So if any of you want to go on a trip and visit the Lincoln Memorial, November 6th. And this review looked at a far broader sweep, 149 human studies and 339 animal studies on fluoride intake and cognition. And the review, this is verbatim, concludes, there is a consistent pattern of findings that high fluoride exposure is associated with decreased intelligence, IQ, in children. And then they go on to say, NTP, so the National Toxicology Program, concludes that fluoride is presumed to be a cognitive neurodevelopmental hazard to humans. And the presumed category is a formal designation where potential toxins are alleged, possible, potential, and then it goes to presumed and definite. To be a definite neurotoxin, there would have to be a clinical trial demonstrating the neurotoxicity, and there can never be a clinical trial of this. So observational research like that conducted is what, that's the highest level that it will have given the evidence. And then they conclude, these are verbatim, this conclusion is based on a consistent pattern of findings in human studies. So for the suggestion that there's only one study, there's one study in a community water fluoridation context. There's many studies, and notably there's a Mexico City study where the levels of fluoride are similar to the Canadian fluoridated cities. They say, and this is important, when focusing on findings from studies with exposures in ranges typically found in the US relating to fluoridation, effects on cognitive neurodevelopment are inconsistent and therefore unclear. So I want to say that because we have to hear that, inconsistent and unclear. So an editorial comment from the Institute team, no one knows for sure. And no one should act sure, because if they act sure, they can't be sure. We're trying to be really objective and balanced, and we're just giving you verbatim statements. There have been calls very recently for access to the data from the recent York University study, and in a letter that was sent to the NIH last week, 20 or so Canadian, or no, actually North American academics wrote to the NIH denouncing the recent Canadian cognition study, critiquing it on many levels, making assertions that the team at York University has refused giving access to their data. And they're refusing to permit reanalysis, and they are not being transparent. These allegations are false. The authors, in fact, are in an active process of discussing with Health Canada a Teflon, bias-free process of making the data available for a secondary analysis. And again, I said there's one thing that really gets under my skin, and that's an assertion, attacking messengers. These authors were subjected to a tremendous amount of peer review, a lot of attacks. I don't think they look at Twitter at bedtime either. So just the last section I'm going to comment on is our section on integrated approaches to oral and dental health. And this was actually a very important section where there was a lot less criticism of our report, probably because there's more agreement from people on both sides of this debate. Fluoride is an element of most national oral health and dental health strategies, whether the fluoride is placed in water, placed in salt or foods as a supplement, or topically applied. And the different national strategies differ on whether fluoride is applied topically rather than orally. And one of the things that Dr. Hardy Lineback was very outspoken about, and he's right about, is that the most desirable place to put fluoride is on the teeth. Now, that doesn't mean that fluoridation in water is not beneficial, but ideally it's on the teeth. Preventive oral health programs are desirable, and I think most people in this room are going to agree to that. We spent some time commenting on Child Smile in Scotland, and Councillor Farrell has been very outspoken about that and its merits, and she's right. She's right. It's a tremendous program, potentially a bit expensive per capita, but Scotland has made a public policy decision to have universal dental coverage for children. We had one party in the recent election campaign calling for that. They have education programs that begin in kids and school-based dental interventions, and then reasonable dental fees. And we know that Alberta has very high dental fees relative to the rest of the country. Importantly, in that integrated approaches section of our report, and I don't say this to say that water fluoridation is not beneficial to the teeth, but it should be noted that countries and communities without community water fluoridation often have better population-wide states of oral dental health. And this is also seen in Lindsay McLaren's Edmonton-Calgary study, where Edmonton, with fluoridation, it's not statistically significant at the late endpoint, but Edmonton has poor oral health or comparable oral health to Calgary despite having water fluoridation. So community water fluoridation, though beneficial, we state in this report, we believe it to be beneficial, it's not enough in an integrated oral health strategy. And I respect what you said in this council chamber. It's not just a municipal policy role. This is an Alberta health matter, AHS matter, and potentially school boards have a role. So we have an important assertion. I mean, we're here at City Council, or at a City Committee meeting. We make the assertion that in the absence of fully integrated dental health programs, water fluoridation does potentially become more important, because when you don't have other things in place, boy, it would be nice to at least have water fluoridation because of its reach and its equitable reach. But another approach potentially is to ramp up alternate strategies, but that costs money. And we've just had a pretty significant change to the public purse in universities, at the municipal level, and elsewhere. I do want to just acknowledge the work of Dr. Rafael Figueroa and the Oral Health Action Plan in Alberta, a very cogent document and strategy. Some pessimism that it needs a lot of money and public sector investment behind it to bring it to another level, but kudos to that. I don't want people to think it's a wasteland in Alberta. And I think everybody in this room, as we talk about water fluoridation, hopefully there at least can be a rally around a shared call for better public policy to support oral and dental health. And as I said, this is not just a call for the City of Calgary to consider, but it's an intergovernmental call. I'm getting tired, so I'm going to close. I'm just going to reiterate that we have been very honored to do this work. It's been very eye-opening to see how public discourse plays out, and and I'll just speak for myself, Aleem, and I said this last night over dinner, we really respect you as a council, and we're not just saying that so we get out with smiles of the room, but we really respect all of you and your thoughtful perspectives in our discussions. Quite honestly, I'm a bit concerned about how public debates are playing out. Our report has a little section on social media and public engagement on such. And more than anything, and I think more than ever, public discourse has become really confusing. You can watch an impeachment process in the US and it's just really confusing. And I wonder if overall public regard for scientists and so-called experts has perhaps declined as a result of all of this. And maybe the public regard for public health as a collective may have decreased. Is civil discourse possible? I loved the chair's notion that there will be a public record from today's discussion, trying to foster civil discourse and then have a record of it, I think is laudable. And thank you on behalf of Calgarians, Canadians, and beyond for that. I hope that our work, our report, and this presentation leaves at least some of you believing in science, first of all, the people, researchers who do the heavy lifting to produce evidence. I have tremendous respect for that, and I really want to assert that. I hope that you believe in public health as a collective, and the collective of public health includes researchers who produce evidence, public health service providers, academic public health people, that's what I am, and decision makers in public health like David and Raphael, Dr. Strong and Dr. Figueiredo. I hope you believe in the University of Calgary as a local resource for evidence-informed decision-making on a number of topics. And I hope you've learned a little bit more about the O'Brien Institute for Public Health and what we believe in and what we work for. Public health has many historical examples of controversial stories. And just in closing, these include, does smoking cause lung cancer and heart disease? Doctors used to prescribe cigarettes and there were fights over which brand was the best. Is menopausal hormone therapy beneficial or harmful? My first research project at Boston University as a public health trainee was on how to convince women, not convince women in a paternalistic way, but have good dialogue about the benefits of hormone therapy for the heart, something that was disproven with good research, and now we recognize potentially more on the harmful side. And that turned my world upside down in 1998 when that research came out, and I had some sleepless nights, and then I moved on with new evidence. Vaccines and autism, a controversial Lancet paper that was discredited, disproven, and there was fraudulent activity with the researcher. Cell phones while driving, big public policy debate. We now more or less accept that it's harmful. Leaded gasoline and the lead exposure causing cognition. In public health, in medicine, most interventions balance risks and benefits. So the dots don't have to be connected in a perfectly monotonic way, benefit or harm. There can be a balancing of benefits and harms. And bottom line, decisions are complicated and they take time to make. And again, I don't envy those who make the ultimate decisions. History suggests one reassuring and hopeful thing. Public health as a collective gets to the bottom of these things. Jim Talbot, who was formerly provincial medical officer of health, had a line, and he's biased, of course, but public health always wins. And he tells a gripping account of AIDS deaths when he was doing his residency in Toronto in the late 1980s. Terrible things. I worked around that time in Kingston, Ontario. One of the most horrible things, but time changes. Advocates like many of you here are part of the collective effort of getting there and the successes of public health. we do win. There has been relentless progress in human health with longer life expectancy than ever before, lower cancer mortality, lower heart disease burden. Let's continue to work collectively toward a fuller understanding, and then eventually have policies that follow logically and fully from evidence. Thank you to the city for inviting us to do this work, to the listed contributors of the report. And I do want to mention a committed core team that aren't mentioned in the report: Jade Marcus, Brittany DeAngelis, Pablo Fernandez, and Angela Taylor. They did a lot of work in the formatting and layout. And thank you all as a committee, and also in an audience behind me. I'll stop now, and if there's time for questions, we'll field those. Thank you.